Hi, Be Health Empowered family. Thank you for coming back for another week of Excuse Me, Doctor. My name is Dr. Melissa Clarke, and I'm just really happy that you all are joining me tonight. As you know, we're here every Monday night, 9 o'clock Eastern, and the purpose is to make sure that everyone listening has accurate information to be able to make wise decisions about their health for themselves, their family, and their communities. It's so important to have accurate information and not make judgments off of misinformation, half truths, or speculation. And so that's why we're here to also debunk all those kinds of false narratives that unfortunately we are exposed to and get pushed our way. So I want to welcome my Facebook family as well as my YouTube family. Remember to hit follow if you're on Facebook watching me, and also the red subscribe button if you're on YouTube watching me. So, this has been another eventful week, and I had a whole nother topic lined up for you tonight. I was going to talk about something having to do with sports and COVID-19, but then Chadwick Boseman passed away on Friday. And I just felt that along with all the other chaos going on in the world, that it was more important to pause and stop and do a mental health check-in. So to that end, we have a really special guest tonight, a psychologist who's been with us here before, Dr. Isabel Blackwood Ellis. She's going to be talking with us about how to dust off our mental health toolkit to make sure that we have all the tools, we know when and how to use them, because we're going to need them. I've seen this meme about 2020 being a cuss word and how people are going to be saying, "What in the 2020 is that?" And I think a lot of people are feeling that way about this year. So I think we're going to get a lot out of this show. And again, I'm really glad that you all have joined us. So please make sure that you start typing in your questions now. It's going to be first come, first serve with the questions. I think you're going to see she's really knowledgeable about a lot of stuff having to do with mental well-being and self-care. And so we're going to get to all your questions tonight. So start to get them ready. And in the meantime, there's been a whole nother world of things happening. So we're going to bring you up to date in our weekly update. So to start off with our weekly update, I want to start off with a non-COVID topic, of course, inspired by Chadwick Boseman, who amazingly lived with a diagnosis of colon cancer, had multiple surgeries, and received several rounds of chemotherapy, all while not making it about himself by divulging to the rest of the world his diagnosis. And so I want to take a minute to talk about colon cancer because it's almost like it's a gift that he's given us to wake us up to the fact that in the African American community, we have the highest incidence of colon cancer and the highest mortality rates from colon cancer of any ethnic group in the United States. We're diagnosed at an earlier age and with more advanced disease. And, as a matter of fact, the age for everyone being diagnosed with colon cancer, African Americans and otherwise, has been getting lower and lower and lower. So much so that the American Cancer Society has revised its guidelines. It used to be that you should start at age 50 to get colon cancer screenings, but now they've put it down to age 45. And what are those options for colon cancer screening? Well, you could get a colonoscopy, which people probably know the best, but there are also ones that aren't as invasive or elaborate as a colonoscopy. You can also get something called a Cologuard test that tests for the DNA of cancer cells in your stool, or you can also get something that just looks, both of these are just stool tests. The other one looks for blood in your stool. And so it's best to talk with your primary care physician, get referred to a gastroenterologist, a specialist of the GI tract, who can talk with you about, based on your family history, based on your risk factors, what's the best test for you and how often you should get it. And then there are things that we can do ourselves to decrease our risk of getting colon cancer. One is stand up more, just exercise. Being sedentary, sitting down for long periods of time, that increases your risk. Diet and nutrition, what we put in our bodies increases our risk. So, eating more vegetables, fruits, fiber, especially probiotics like kimchi and yogurt and whole grains, all those things decrease our risk of colon cancer. And we need to decrease the amount of red meat that we eat, beef, pork, and lamb, as well as processed meats like hot dogs and bacon and lunch meats. So, overall, substituting out the healthy things for the unhealthy things are a great way to address our risk for colon cancer. So, next, let's move into the numbers. Uh, Unfortunately, when it comes to COVID-19 this week, we've passed a huge milestone, which is 6 million cases. But as I always say, that is a gross underrepresentation of the actual cases in the United States. People who've chosen not to get testing because they figure they have it or because they don't want that thing going in their nose, the unavailability of tests in many places, the unclear guidelines around testing, all that has led to an undercount of the number of cases we have, anywhere from 7 to 10 times. So that means we're really closer to 50 to 60 million cases in the United States, not just 6 million. And we now also have 182,000 deaths. Again, we know that that's undercounted. Those 182,000 families that have been affected and lost a loved one to COVID-19. And then finally, we have over 3.5 million people who've recovered, and that's wonderful. But we don't know, unfortunately, that some of those individuals will be what are called long haulers, those people who continue to have symptoms for weeks and potentially months. We don't know how long because we haven't been observing this long. But we do know that it's not just as simple as clearing up like the flu or a common cold and then going your merry way for some people. And then what I call the next thing I want to update you on is the plasma okey doke. So I discussed last week about how the FDA had approved the use of plasma that contained antibodies from people who had recovered for COVID-19 to be able to treat people who were having a hard time getting over COVID-19. Well, it was premature that they approved that because the science just wasn't there. And I want to explain a little bit deeper why that's the case. So what they did was they gave a bunch of people plasma and they just observed to see if they got better. And a bunch of people did get better. But the problem with that is we don't know because there wasn't a comparison group, a randomized control trial. We don't know how many people would have just gotten better anyway. So think of it like this. Imagine a bunch of people came into the hospital and you handed everybody a teddy bear. And then after a week, you measured how many people got better. Well, there are going to be some people in that group who get better anyway, but you're not going to say it's because they got the teddy bear. You have to have a comparison group of people who didn't get the teddy bear. That way you know the number of people who would have gotten better anyway. Well, they didn't do that for this plasma trial. And so that's why it's the okey doke. And we have to make sure that we don't fall for bad science. That's one of the reasons I'm here, to point that stuff out. And there are other people out here doing it too. So my job is to make sure you get the right information. The next good thing to keep in mind, though, is that vitamin B is something that we should all add to our regimens and make sure, especially if you're a vegan or a vegetarian, because vegan and vegetarian diets are low in vitamin B. And it turns out that vitamin B has some antiviral properties. It helps boost your immune response, and it improves your lung function and your gut function. So it can really help address some of the theoretical issues that come along with COVID-19. But even so, even if it didn't, it's still an important component of our diet. And so eggs have a lot of vitamin B, And it's also great, as I mentioned, you can get it through supplements as well. Now, the testing walk back. Actually, before we get that, I want to talk about safe camping because that's important before we get to the testing thing. So, in Maine, there was a study that came out of 4 summer camps where they were able to keep their overnight campers safe. What they did was they had them tested before they even arrived. Shortly after they arrived, they got another test. And then they got put into small groups, cohorts of children in the camp, and you stuck with that group no matter what. It was your counselor, 1 or 2 counselors, and a group of kids. Overall, over the 1,000 students in those 4 summer camps, only 2 camp counselors tested positive and 1 child tested positive. And they isolated the 30 people that child had been in touch with, tested them, and it turned out that they tested negative. And so a safe time was had by all in these 4 summer camps. What's the moral of the story? Testing, testing, testing is important. So the fact that the CDC this week said that it wasn't important to test people who are asymptomatic, who've been without symptoms, who've been exposed, knowingly exposed to somebody with COVID-19 was, I think, just wrong information to put out and just trying to de-emphasize the failure that we've had with testing in these 6 months that we've been in this pandemic. If anything, we need to be ramping up our testing so that we can do what that summer camp did, or so that an aide who works with an older person can know, even if I don't have symptoms, is it safe for me to go to work? So that people who work in schools, if they've been exposed to COVID-19, they can know whether to come to school or not. Testing is key. And so I want to end our recap on that note. And now we're about to go into our daily debunk. And it's a special week. I actually have 2 daily debunks for you this week. The first is, now that I've had COVID, I don't need to wear a mask, right? Well, unfortunately, it appears that that's not the case. 2 high-profile cases have grabbed our attention this week. The first was a gentleman in Hong Kong who has turned out to have COVID-19 twice. The good news is the second time he had it, he didn't have any symptoms, so that's great. However, we have a case right here in the United States of a gentleman who had COVID in April, had a couple of tests in between that were negative, and he felt better. And then again in August, he got symptoms, and it turned out that he tested positive again. This time it appears he got a new strain of coronavirus. Now, we know that the common cold, which is a type of coronavirus, we know that, we've had multiple colds over our lifetime. So it's kind of not a surprise that it looks like this related coronavirus does cause reinfection. We also have known that our antibodies go down when it comes to COVID-19 after about 8 to 12 weeks after being infected. But we have what's called cellular immunity, our T cells that remember and can produce antibodies if we are re-exposed to the COVID-19 virus. So, bottom line, if you've had COVID, still wear a mask, still physically distance, still practice good hygiene. And then our second debunk. I saw this video, and I'm sure you all have seen it, of a guy who's vaping in order to show that masks don't work. So, can you roll the video?
Above and keep my glasses from fogging. Lo and behold, the aerosols go all around it. Has no effect on me spreading aerosols to you. Now, a cloth mask I borrowed.
So he goes on to demonstrate different masks. So is this really true? Well, he says he's a doctor. I don't know if that's true or not. And in any good misinformation video, there's some half-truths. There's a grain of truth buried in there. So in this one, we know that not all masks provide a tight fit. We know that. Cloth masks, surgical masks, KN95 masks do not provide a tight fit. There's only one mask that does, and that's the N95 mask that healthcare workers wear. And because they're in short supply, The public has been asked to wear cloth masks, or they're now selling surgical masks. But we know that masks work. We know that in countries that have used masks, that has helped them to flatten the curve. We know that surgeons, there's a reason it's called a surgical mask. Surgeons wear it to block viruses and bacteria from coming out of their mouths and dropping into the sterile surgical field when they're operating on you. The key is this: the size of the micro droplets that contain the coronavirus, if you're infected, that come out of your mouth as saliva, are much larger than that vape smoke that you saw him blow. It's also less voluminous. So he took a big breath of vape smoke in and he blew it out. It doesn't contain the aerosols to the same degree as talking, coughing, or sneezing. And those aerosols move differently because they're bigger. They have different properties. So the mask does help to block some of those particles. The other thing is, we know, like I said, that air escapes from the side. We know this. You can even feel it when you wear a cloth mask or a surgical mask. But the key is this: risk mitigation. The idea is to decrease the dose of virus that you're exposed to. When you wear a mask, you block a significant amount of virus from escaping from your mouth and nose. And so that protects the other person who's away from you. So, coupled with physical distancing, coupled with the other person wearing a mask, that's why we talk about the importance of doing both. I see a lot of people out there wearing a mask, being up on somebody else. That's not enough. The physical distancing part is important as well. So those are our 2 weekly debunks for the week. And now I want to get into our show for this evening that's all about mental well-being. It feels like we've been assaulted on so many fronts. We're in the middle of a health pandemic. We have job loss, imminent evictions, repeated videos of Black people being shot and killed by policemen, and even our allies being murdered by vigilantes in the street. Blatant evidence of 2 justice systems, a politically polarized country, an upcoming divisive election, Category 4 hurricanes, homeschooling, tornadoes, the loss of our social supports, being able to hug people, even see people's smiles as they're coming down the street towards us. People following rules versus others blatantly disregarding it and feeling frustrated by that. An increase in child abuse and domestic violence. Politicians acting any kind of way that, we would have been, if it was our children acting that way, we would reprimand them. And then, of course, the death of our heroes: C.T. Vivian, John Lewis, Kobe Bryant, Chadwick Boseman, and then just today, John Thompson, all figures who lived a life of purpose and meaning and whose lives were inspirational to us all. And so, for all these reasons, I thought that it was really important to do a mental health check-in. So we have a very special guest with us tonight, Dr. L. Isabel Blackwood Ellis. She's a clinical psychologist with over 25 years of experience providing psychological services to children, adolescents, adults, couples, schools, and organizations. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Blackwood Ellis. Thank you so much for being with us tonight.
It is indeed my pleasure and honor to be back here with you, Dr. Melissa. I'm really, really excited to share what my thoughts are and what my experiences are.
Wonderful. Well, we're going to have a dialogue, but I'm encouraging everybody, like I said, to get your questions ready. Please enter them in the chat because we're going to get to them very, very shortly. So I saw a meme that said that I'm the number 13 and I'm the worst number there is. And then, no, 666, I'm the worst number there is. And then another one and then it then said 2020, I'm the worst number there is. Heifers, please. So I think a lot of people are feeling that way about 2020. We're feeling overwhelmed by everything that's going on. So Dr. Blackwood Ellis, can you start off by telling us what's the best way to not feel overwhelmed? during everything that's happening?
I don't know that we can stop ourselves from feeling overwhelmed, because we're experiencing major losses on so many different levels. We're experiencing all kinds of changes in our lives, and changes that we didn't expect, changes that we didn't necessarily want. It's causing a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety, a lot of depression, anger, and a lot of that anger is changing to rage, frustration, fear, uncertainty, and a lot of pain. So much pain. Pain from what's happening to us, pain from what we're losing, pain from not knowing what to expect. The ground that we had walked on before, where we could expect certain things, we don't have that anymore. And so to feel overwhelmed is not something that we would necessarily not feel. I think the key is what we choose to do about the different feelings that we're experiencing. We need to be in touch with and to own what's going on inside of us, and then figure out what we need to do in order to be able to find a better sense of balance, find the floor that we are walking on, and find some level of stability for ourselves, for our children, for our loved ones, and for each other.
Absolutely. So, when it comes to sort of building that practical toolkit that helps us to deal with some of these feelings, how would you say that we need to go about that?
I think the first thing is to be honest with yourself, to acknowledge what's going on inside of you, to really learn how to name what it is that you're feeling,
Hmm.
and to develop some of the sources. And a lot of times we'll name anger, and anger is probably there, but I want you to go a little deeper and figure out what's under that anger. And often under that anger is pain. And oftentimes it's a little easier to figure out what to do with pain than it is anger. And also, anger, oftentimes, if we don't take time to really think, can lead to impulsive actions. And those impulsive actions make it worse. We need to be mindful. We need to take a step back to balance ourselves with what balances you individually, and then figure out what it is that you need to do. And balancing comes from meditation, from prayer, from eating right, from exercising. Don't have a day, and definitely don't have a weekend go by where you don't see the light of day or the sunshine, um, where you're not in touch with other human beings. And social distancing doesn't mean you don't still connect. We have to connect with each other and learn from each other and support each other in different ways and be creative.
Yeah.
And, when we're creative, I know when I'm creative, I feel a lot better because I can see something complete. And we also need to be able to complete things. I do puzzles because I can put things together and I can see that I've accomplished something. We have to have some closure to some pieces in our life, as well as the uncertainty that's there. So those are just a few. I'll be talking about others. But again, it
Sure.
starts with being in touch with yourself, figuring out how you can balance yourself better, and then how to make good decisions for yourself, your family, your loved ones.
I've noticed a lot of people during this pandemic have taken up walking or running or getting in shape. I know for me, I take long walks in my favorite location, which is a regional park close to where I live. And it also reminds me of the five self-health actions that you listed several things, but I call them the five self-health actions: getting enough sleep, 7 to 8 hours a night, staying well hydrated, 2 liters of water a day, eating right, in terms of getting the right nutrition, um, movement, because that releases certain chemicals in your body that are important for that physical and mental balance. And then last but not least, stress relief. And you mentioned meditation, prayer, and also Tai Chi, yoga, any hobby, like you said, doing puzzles, especially ones that give you that sense of accomplishment. For me, it's words with friends, which my husband gets on about me all the time. So maybe you could explain, I've heard a lot of people, and actually I'm involved in a project with some churches in DC that do outreach to their congregants. And one of the two of the predominant things that they are detecting are people who are anxious
Yes.
and people who are depressed.
Yes.
Can you talk to us a little bit of how do we recognize anxiety in ourselves, and how do we recognize depression in ourselves?
I think it has a lot to do with if you're worried a lot and you're having difficulty shaking the worry or figuring out what it is that you can do about it. If you're sad for long periods of day, if again you can't shake that sadness, and I don't mean shake it, I mean find some things to help you to feel better, to feel more balanced. If you can't figure out sort of what it is that's pulling you down, and reaching out to others, reaching out for different sources won't help you to feel better. Has to do with the length of it, has to do with the intensity of it. It has to do with whether or not you can do something to help to relieve it.
Yeah. And I would suspect too that it might also have to do with, is it impeding your ability to function,
Yes.
to
Yeah.
work, to
Yeah.
have a healthy relationship? Are you bringing that into your relationship with, you mentioned pain and anger. Are you bringing, is it morphing into something that's disrupting your relationships with your family or your friends?
Yes.
So, given that, there are different kinds of mental health professionals, and so maybe you could talk to us about what are the differences, say, between a counselor, a psychologist, and a psychiatrist, and how do you know which one to reach out to?
I think a lot of it has to do with the training, the length of training, the intensity of training. Psychiatrists are medical professionals, so they go to med school and they can prescribe medicine and they can also do counseling. Some only do medication, some do both. Psychologists are PhD or master's level. They have to do some form of research. They tend to focus more on the counseling. Psychologists also can do testing to help children to help understand, how children learn best, what it is that they need in school, as well as the counseling. Counselors focus more on counseling alone.
Mhm,
So there's some overlap in the
mhm.
different professions, but there's slight differences in terms of the training. And who
Yeah,
you go to, it has a lot to do with who has the expertise that it is that you need, as well as who you can connect with. Your counselor, you must be able to connect with so that
mhm.
you'll be open and that you can get the help that you need.
How would you suggest that somebody figure that out before even meeting you?
I don't know that you can figure it out before meeting. I think it
Okay.
has to do with your initial conversation.
Mhm,
I spend a lot of time during the initial conversation call just to see whether or not there's a click,
mhm.
because I want to be able to work with people that potentially that I can help, that I can connect with, and that can connect with me. So interview
Yeah,
your potential counselor and see what's going to work for you.
yeah.
And that's very empowering and a very important step forward in terms of helping yourself.
I talk about that in Excuse Me Doctor, about even interviewing your medical doctor, because that relationship, that rapport is so important. And I list a whole checklist of things that people should look for. So thank you for bringing that up. in terms of the importance of interviewing
Yes.
your healthcare professional. So, we've talked about the good ways to cope with stuff, or the ways that are most likely to be successful in the long term. Let me put it that way. What do you say to people who say, "Hey, look, I just need a little something to take the edge off every day." Whether that's alcohol, whether it's vaping, whether it's a pill. Um, what would you say to those people in terms of how do you know when you're becoming dependent on a substance? And, what are the signs that you might look for in yourself or potentially in a family member?
You hit on two of them. I need it every day. If it's something that
That's
occasionally,
a little something, something, doc. I mean, come on.
yeah, I understand that, but are there some other things that you might use that might be helpful also? If you need it, are you dependent on it? And if you don't have it, can you still cope? All of those things are sort of warning signs. Can I take a few days off? Can I take a week off and still be fine and use something else? That's a good test to see, am I really using a little bit too much of this in order to cope, and therefore coming down a slippery slope?
Right. And we know that substance abuse has been increasing
Mhm.
during this pandemic, unfortunately, because there's so many triggers to people to use substances. And liquor stores were deemed essential, and everybody wondered about that decision, right? But there are a lot of people who said, well, people who are addicted to substances, if you close or alcohol specifically, if you close
Right,
liquor stores, that's going to throw them into a health crisis.
right.
So I would imagine that might have been one of the reasons why they were kept open. um One of the other things, we talked about rage, and we've talked about anger.
Mhm.
It seems like Black people just can't catch a break. I mean, from the police shootings to, as I mentioned, the loss of our heroes, to the disproportionate deaths that people are dying of COVID-19 and other things
Mhm.
during this pandemic. How can we as Black people not develop a victim mentality? Meaning feeling that all this stuff is happening to us and we have no control over it.
There is a lot of things that are happening. There is a lot of pain. I think the key is the second piece of it, which is, where can we get our control back? How can we figure out what it is that we can do about it? And what you can do about it is different from what I can do about it, which is different from what someone else can do about it. Again, it's searching for inside for our creativity. What is our role? And what can our role be in terms of helping to change some of what's going on in our society? And it's different for each of us. I think the other possible problem is sort of the crowd mentality, that I will do what my neighbor is doing as opposed to what it is that I can do best in order to help to make changes. And changes have to be made on so many different levels. It's not just one, it's so many different levels.
Right. And I think that might be one reason why people are saying vote. I mean, it's the most immediate
Mhm,
way that we have control over our environment. You mentioned creativity. Can you
mhm.
talk a little bit more about that?
Before I go there, I want to say that, Dr. Melissa, what you're doing is so, so important in terms of the change. It's educating people, it's helping them to know exactly where are the truths versus where are the falsehoods, so that they can make good decisions moving forward. Um, Creativity has to do with, again, what's unique in us, how we go about making really good decisions for ourselves, how we search inside to figure out what role we're going to play. Is it in going and helping somebody? Is it in offering a smile in a different sort of way than how we used to smile? Is it reaching out? Is it having a party in a different way than we used to? All of those things can help us to feel better in the immediate. But then there's also, how do we help to affect change?
Yeah.
And again, there are many different ways to do this.
One thing that I've been concerned about are individuals who don't feel that they have any agency in their life. And so therefore, the threat of the coronavirus is just like, this theoretical thing that, it's more important that I live for today because tomorrow's not promised to me anyway, because I really don't feel like I have control over my circumstance. Do you find that that's some of the byproduct of all this that's been going on?
I think there are some who definitely feel that, I just live for today. And it can be because I have no control or because I don't care or, many different reasons, or
Yeah.
because it's not going to affect me, or it's only old people, or it's only Black
Right.
people, or,
Right.
the list goes on and on. And again, educating people in ways that hopefully they can actually hear, and some wake up calls to do differently. Because again, we have to do differently because what we're doing just is not working.
Right.
It's not working for us personally, it's not working for us collectively.
Yeah.
And stop, the divisiveness that you talked about earlier in terms of all, these different camps, as opposed to let's pool our resources and figure
Right.
out how better to address, what's going on. Is
Yeah. I had a really fun experience this morning. I got to lecture a group of 50 students at Howard University, mostly freshmen. And I was talking about the pandemic, and one of the students made the observation. I said, I don't bash young people when I see these pictures on, people going out and sort of living their best life. I don't bash them because I understand the mentality. I might have been one of those young people when I was 20, 21 myself, but at the same time, I think it's important to understand the reasons why. And one of the reasons he said for young Black people is that for African Americans, we've been denied the right to be able to go where we want to go and do what we want to do. And so there's a sense of rebellion in young people right now. How do we balance, especially for our young people? How do we balance, we take the rage and the frustration that we have, and how do we channel that into a passion for change rather than a desire for retribution, revenge, or anger that consumes us from the inside?
that is the question of the hour. That is very, very difficult to do because there is so much anger and it is so unfair. I think if we tell, young people, tell ourselves that it's just going to get better and just keep waiting without having some kind of guidelines for how to go about doing that. Um, that 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 it's not going to change. That, finding again creative ways to organize people for good. Young people are looking for something that they can hold on to, and
Mhm.
so finding things to help them to hold on and to help and using their intelligence for how to make changes, I think is
Mhm.
really very important. Um, getting them involved. I don't know if if they there was a back and forth in your conversation with them this morning. Was there any of that?
Well, the professor whose class it was wanted me to speak and then save questions to the end. So that's what I spoke, and then there was a dialogue once we went to the Q&A.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then following up with that so
Yeah.
that, again, they can see what they can do differently, I think is so important. That sometimes we shut them down. And then there's the anger. And so we can't shut them down because they have so much to offer. And they really, how they do things is somewhat different from how we did things. And yet we really have to listen. I think it's about listening better.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I was
Exactly.
with a couple of young people over the weekend. And just to hear their questions, to hear their fear, to hear them just want to have a place to be able to talk
Yeah.
and to hear. And we need to be having those kinds of forums with our young people, as opposed to you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do that.
Right. Because they're hearing a lot of that.
Yeah,
They're
we're
definitely
all
hearing a
here.
lot of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're all hearing a lot of
We're-
that, but it's harder for them to process. I mean, because their brains are not, their brains are hardwired in the teenage years to require social interaction in order to develop.
Right.
And also they, not until they're 25 do they understand consequences fully. So all those things are even biological reasons why we have to, as you mentioned, provide those forums, provide those outlets so that they can develop properly.
Right. And the tricky thing also is that I find from, my own children, but also children that I work with, that they want to talk when they want to talk. It's not necessarily when we have the schedule for them to talk. And we have to be open to listen to them.
Yeah.
And to really hear what they're saying, because their minds are unbelievable.
Yeah.
And we can probably learn a whole lot from them if we give them the chance.
Yeah.
And our typical routines that we're going to do this, that, and the other, it just doesn't work with young people. It really
Yeah. I was reading an article in, I think, the Post this morning about how parents are having a difficult time explaining to young ones about the death of Chadwick Boseman. How would you suggest that parents go about maybe not just explaining the death of Chadwick Boseman, but death in general?
Yeah.
Because, as I mentioned before, several heroes have transitioned, including him, but also family members because of COVID and other reasons.
Yeah. That's one of the real tough topics, and it really depends on the age of the child. It depends on, I think, religious beliefs. I think it also depends on how open the conversations tend to be within the home. I think it's important for them to understand, obviously, that that person is not coming back. But what's equally as important is helping to understand what the child understands and what it is that they're feeling as a result of what's going on. Because, loss often triggers previous losses. And so they may be feeling the loss of their icon or their mentor, but it may also be triggering other losses also. So again, a lot of it with children is about listening. And, a lot of parents will say, oh, well, I had a conversation with my child and I was like, okay, so who did the talking? And the parent said, well, I told him this, and the other, and the child never said anything. And so again, conversations go both ways, and really learning how to listen to each other, children, as well as each other as adults. And I think that at this time, we need to be listened to, we need to be heard, and we need to be listening. And if we did more of that, I think that we could solve a lot of the problems that are going on in our society.
Excuse me, doctor. We have a question.
Oh, okay.
We have a question coming from Jacqueline Renee Carlson. Can you please talk about the issue of MIS-C syndrome in children? Uh, Her niece is suffering from this children's disease affected by COVID.
Yes. So that stands for multi-system inflammatory disease. That is the disease that happens as a result of COVID infection. So it might appear that the child has gotten better after an initial COVID infection. And then this phase of super inflammation comes along. And that inflammation can affect every organ system in the body, from the heart to the lungs to the kidney. It's very similar to another disease that has been around for a long time called Kawasaki's disease, also one that follows a viral infection. But this one specifically that this name has been given to is the disease that happens after COVID-19. Luckily, we have ways to treat it, anti-inflammatory medications like steroids, blood thinners that also prevent the damage that comes from blood clots. And the great news is most children, the majority of them, do well. We are seeing more children, Black and Latino children, who are getting this. It seems that children, the pre-existing conditions that set children up for this are asthma and obesity, but certainly over 50% of children have no pre-existing conditions and develop this as well. And but like I said, the most important thing to remember is that the majority, far and away, most of the children who get this do perfectly fine, even if they have to be hospitalized.
Excuse me, doctor. We have another question. This one comes from Max Gregory Anderson. What are the doctor's thoughts concerning the incorporating of spiritual practices in one to help one understand their circumstances? Spiritual things such as there includes one's date of birth or time of birth and perhaps its impact on their personality. That was a mouthful.
I think that totally understanding a person that incorporates all of what you're talking about, as well as cultural, spiritual, emotional, is again part of understanding who somebody is. And and then once you understand them, then it becomes easier to then figure out what it is that they individually will need in any given situation. So yes, indeed, all of those things are important in understanding what the needs are and how best to address whatever it is that's going on with them.
Yeah. And you also mentioned spirituality, I think, Max. So the medical literature talks about meditation, talks about prayer as research proven ways to decrease your stress hormone levels, which actually improve your immune system. So even the medical and scientific community recognizes the importance of a spiritual approach to life and the foundation that it can give you to weather the storms that we've been talking about.
Yeah. One of the things I told you, Dr. Melissa, when you asked me to come on, was that I had my Sunday school class at 7 o'clock.
Right.
And so I had to make sure that I could get to my Sunday school class, because again, that's one of the things that I find and the other women in the class that really helps to balance them and helps to deal with some of the feelings of being overwhelmed, of being stressed, of sort of dealing with all of what's going on inside.
Yes.
And we all have to find things that help to balance us. And that's really one of the keys, the balance that you can get in your life, for sure.
Absolutely.
Excuse me, doctor. We have a question coming from Valerie Spalding. Her neighbor tested positive for COVID a month ago and never wears a mask when he walks the neighborhood. Plus, he's an extrovert and talks to everybody. He does stay 6 feet away, but are we still at risk?
So he's everyone is at risk in that situation. What he might not realize is that he's at risk. Maybe not so much so that it's only been a month since he got over COVID, but as I mentioned, around that 8 to 12 week mark is when the antibodies start to or they disappear completely that he may have built up and developed to COVID-19. So once that comes around, he will be at risk, and feel free to show him this video. Maybe that'll help. And you're not so much at risk from him as he is from you once those 8 to 12 weeks expire. Once they expire and he can get COVID again, then he now becomes a threat to you as well. So important for him to see this video. Please share.
Excuse me, doctor. We have another question from Valerie. My daughter wanted me to see if you could address post-COVID dysautonomia.
Dysautonomia.
Dysautonomia. I did not go to med school.
But you're doing a great job. And for everybody who might not know, that's my husband, Wayne Bruce, our producer. So dysautonomia basically means that the nervous system is affected by COVID-19. And we know that either because the blood supply to the nerves get affected, or we don't know if it's direct nerve damage. But either way, it can affect the nerves in our body that help us to regulate our autonomic nervous system. That autonomic nervous system is responsible for everything from digestion to urination to even being able to stand upright. So some of the symptoms of dysautonomia might be falling over, losing your balance easily. It could be sweating because that controls your ability to sweat as well, your autonomic nervous system. And so I don't know that we have been able to research it enough to be able to say how long this might last for, if there is a treatment for it. But I would recommend that you see a neurologist, which would be the specialist that could help sort through those questions with you.
Excuse me, doctor. We have a question from Marv West. Prior to COVID-19, students were limited to 2 hours of screen time. With online schooling, some students are online up to 6 hours per day. What are the possible behavioral implications to excessive hours online?
Excellent question, Marv West. Dr. Isabel?
Yeah, this is really interesting. I said this the last time I was on, but I wanted to say it again, which is that one of the popular psychology magazines came out with the detrimental effects of too much screen time. And I'm sure that they had had researched it and did all of that prior to the shutdown. It came out like a week or two after the shutdown. So indeed, we don't know all the possible implications that are going to happen after, whenever we get out of COVID-19. And it is difficult. But right now, that's the way schools are. I think it's, again, so important to balance, to make sure that your child has some kind of interaction also. That's not screen related, that you continue to do family games, that you make sure that they're actually reading real books, not just online books, that they're learning how to deal with competition, that some of the things that we take out of school because it's online, that you find ways to put those back in so that there can be a balance. Structure is extremely important for children. And so make sure that the life that you create for your child now has structure, has boundaries, has rules, helps to keep them as balanced as possible, given the fact that right now they're online for most of the day. Recess, they need to go outside, or breaks, they need to, again, have some of the outdoor activities as well. So, yeah, there's a lot we don't know that's going to come out as a result.
So, we've been talking a lot about children. I want to go a little bit to the other end of the spectrum, and that's people who are caregivers,
Mhm.
who might be taking care of an older parent at the same time as having to maybe balance things with their kids. That sandwich generation that's being pulled in a couple different ways. I've been talking with a friend of mine today who was diagnosed with COVID. Her 80-year-old mom has COVID. She's now in the hospital. Her 14-year-old son has COVID, and she's trying to make sure that her 13-year-old daughter and her 21-year-old son don't also get it. And she's more worried about that than herself. Can you speak to the importance of self-care and knowing when to focus on yourself?
I think we go to most of us have been on a plane. And, as they're telling us what it is we need to do is we need to put on our own oxygen mask first before we put on the oxygen mask of our children. We have to take care of ourselves, because if we don't take care of ourselves, number one, we may not be around to take care of our children or our parents. Um, Self-care, spending some time in the morning, spending some time in the evening to just ask yourself, where am I? How am I feeling? What do I need? What did I do to take care of myself today? Is extremely important. Finding ways to go out and actually seek out your supports and get some supports is also extremely important. You can't take care of others if you're not taking care of yourself, because you'll just wear yourself down. And I know it's hard, and I know it takes time, but it is imperative. It is imperative.
Absolutely. So, um, I want to thank this hour has just flown. I just want to thank Dr. Isabel Blackwood Ellis for her wisdom and for her time and for her sharing with us. I think we've taken away several important principles. I think we ended with probably one of the most important ones, and that's taking time for self-care. But we also heard about ways to brush up our mental health toolkit, whether it be through spirituality, whether it be through the 5 self-health actions that I talk about, whether it be just owning the emotions and identifying them so that we can talk them through and reach out for help. We talked about addiction. We've covered a lot of ground. But just keep in mind that during this time, which may unfortunately potentially keep going as the wintertime comes, there's less sunlight, there's more flu around, and that reminds me to remind you to make sure to get your flu shot. The elections coming up, which are probably going to be even more divisive, that we need to rely on those things that bring us joy, that bring us structure, that bring us purpose, and that allow us to best care for ourselves. I heard one thing that someone advised: when you get up in the morning, just think about 5 things that you're grateful for, because that can set the whole tone for the rest of the day. So I want to thank you all for tuning in. Again, I want to thank Dr. Blackwood Ellis for her wonderful advice. And I'm going to be back next week, Monday night, 9 p.m. live. Tomorrow morning, I normally am on the Russ Parr Morning Show, but he's on vacation, so that means I'm on vacation too. But I will see you next week. And until I talk to you, please remember, be wise, be well, and be health empowered.